Welcome, Ms. Kristalina Georgieva. Thank you so much for making the time to speak to the National.
It is my great pleasure. And since this is the beginning of the year, I would like to wish you and all in the audience good health and good fortunes in 2022.
Thank you very much. And I wish you the best also. And hopefully 2022 will be a kinder, healthier year for everybody. We're starting the year not necessarily how we had hoped. There is a new wave of the COVID-19 virus. And of course, there are concerns of the impact it will have not only on the health of people, but of course, the health of the economic recovery we were all hoping to be in 2022. So I wanted to start our conversation by asking you, how much of an impact is this latest wave having on the global economic recovery?
It is true that we were hoping to have more of a momentum in the recovery in 2022. Already in the last months of the previous year, we have seen this momentum weakening. Why? Because the two big engines of growth of the world economy, the US and China, were slowing down. And then we got hit by Omicron. There is no doubt that this is going to add to economic disruptions, and it would add to uncertainty. We are currently calculating the exact impact. We will come up with revised outlook towards the end of this month, but I can say already that unfortunately, vis-a-vis our latest outlook in October, there would be downgrades. What are we focusing on? On three big topics. One, we are stepping in 22 having already used a great deal of our capacity to protect people and the economy. And conditions in countries are very different. In 2020, it was tough, but from a policy standpoint, it was somewhat easier. We had universal recommendations, monetary policy accommodation, fiscal policy support, protect the most vulnerable. Now, conditions are different, and therefore, policies have to be calibrated differently in different countries. Two, what we were cautioning about for quite some time, this growing divergence within countries and across countries. Unfortunately, it is deepening. Why? Different access to vaccines and different policy space to help people and businesses. What breaks my heart is that after decades of convergence, poorer countries catching up with the better offs, now we see the opposite. Advanced economies, small number of emerging markets, are already reaching their pre-pandemic levels. Everybody else is falling further behind. And three, we see new issues that we have to wrestle with: inflation, debt, social unrest. What is the answer? We have to work together. We need global cooperation to deal with these challenges.
You raise important points. I mean, firstly, it seems clear that by the end of the month, when we hear from you and from the IMF about the World Economic Outlook, that there will be a revision. We had hoped for, the IMF had said 4.9% growth, the hope for 2022, but it seems it will soften given the developments that we've seen.
That is very likely to be happening, and of course we would see differentiated impact in different countries. And let me say something very positive still. We have learned how to function with the pandemic still around us. We have deployed our scientists to put protections for our people. We now are more effective. Every wave that comes, the restrictions it causes are milder, and this wave seems to be like a bushfire spreading very rapidly, but with all these protections and the mutation of the virus seems to be less dramatic. So while there would be impact, we are hoping that it would be less severe. But let's remember that on top of Omicron, we have other issues that we have to be concentrated on. The biggest concern for us at the fund is uncertainty. It has become more, not less so.
Now, one of the issues you raised is this uneven recovery, and you've given warnings about this previously. You've spoken a number of times about the concern about an uneven recovery. What is missing? Global cooperation is needed, but what is missing, and can the G20 play a role? How is the IMF tackling this issue of uneven recovery?
What we focus on, and I strongly believe rightly so, is the key inequality we face, and it is unequal access to vaccines. Unfortunately, the world has not met a target that we all aligned around. Actually came from the work of my colleagues at the fund, 40% at least vaccinations in all countries by the end of 21. Where we landed, 80 countries didn't meet this target. Objectively, some 20 to 30 could have not, because of instability, because of violence, because of problems in delivering vaccines. But many countries could have if they had an earlier access to vaccines. Now we have a target of 70% by mid-2022. Now is the moment to mobilize towards this target. I want to say something still positive, that COVAX did deliver 1 billion doses by the end of 2021. And what we are now recognizing is that supply, as critical as it is, not enough. We also have to have conditions in countries for the vaccine to turn into a shot in the arm. And that is where the attention also needs to go. And then secondly, we know that countries with more capacity to help their people, to help their businesses, with strong fundamentals, are doing better. So you asked me what the IMF is doing. On the first count on vaccines, we have been on the forefront to create attention and focus, and also to build this multilateral leaders task force to accelerate vaccinations. But of course, our main job has been help those that cannot help themselves. During this crisis, we have provided nearly $170 billion of financing. Just to put it in perspective, our total financing is around 265 billion. So nearly 2/3 has been done in this last 2 years. And what is more important is to how many countries. 90 countries have benefited from financing from the fund, and 175 countries have benefited from policy support from the fund. We also have done something remarkable, which is bring the membership together for a historic $650 billion special drawing rights allocation. This is a shot in the arm of the global economy, particularly valuable for countries with limited capacity. Just to translate all these figures into your region, 60 billion of support, 17 billion lending, and then the rest is from the special drawing rights. So it is a crisis like no other, and the IMF has acted accordingly. We have done more and faster than ever in our history. Going forward, I'm going to be very, very clear. We do see, with inflation possibly leading to tightening of financial conditions, a more significant problem of debt for many countries, and possibly more needs for the fund to be there for the membership. We still have a sufficient capacity, 700 billion lending capacity. We are there for our members.
I want to just pick up on this point of debt. I mean, the IMF declared that global debt reached a record $226 trillion in 2020 and warned about this crisis of debt that we're going to see in globally. How more can debt be tackled? I mean, you say that, of course, countries can turn to the fund for drawing rights, but what more can be done to tackle that?
Look, the problem of that is very, very serious. It was serious before the pandemic, and of course it has become more serious since. We have seen the fastest increase of debt levels since the Second World War. Mm-hmm. Rightly so, that was an appropriate response, but it causes significant risks for countries that are now in that distress. And unfortunately, for low-income countries, we have a very significant number of them now in that position of that distress. Also, for some emerging markets that had access to borrow, let's remember, when interest rates are low, when there is search for income-generating opportunities, it is not difficult to raise money on the markets. This is now starting to somewhat change. And we know that the Fed is going to advance their plans for a monetary policy normalization. So what is necessary? And let me make 2 points that are equally significant. One, I want to give credit to the Saudi G20 presidency for putting in place the so-called common framework for addressing debt, unsustainable debt, and for giving the president of the World Bank, David Malpass, and myself the opportunity to press for debt service suspension. The debt service suspension is over as of December this last year, so it ended. That makes the common framework, bringing both official and private lenders together, very, very important. And yet, it still needs to deliver on the scale that would be required. We currently have only 3 countries, Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia, that have asked for the common framework, and it has been a difficult process. So we have to create incentives for other countries to step forward. In our view, immediate debt service suspension once a country asks for treatment is this incentive, and then we have to make the process more predictable and timely. And then I think we would see the common framework doing what is expected from it on the scale that is necessary. 2, we have to assume that we might have countries that are outside of the common framework. In other words, not just the debt service suspension initiative eligible countries in trouble. And we have to prepare for that. We need to discuss all instruments that the world has for debt resolution that have been applied in the past, that have been discussed but not applied in the past. And I can assure you that the fund takes this extremely seriously. It is on the top of our agenda. You will see the discussions in our governing body, the one that meets on spring and annual meetings, or in exceptional circumstances. You will see this topic as well as on our board of directors presented, discussed with specific outcomes.
So in addition, and this is really important in terms of how to tackle the debt issue, and as you said, it's amongst your top priorities. The other concern, of course, is inflation. You made reference now to Federal Reserve and some of the possibilities that we see in the coming few months to tackle inflation. This is impacting people directly across the board. What can be done further to tackle inflation? How much of a concern is that for you at the fund?
It is a concern because what we are seeing now, it is sticking and affecting populations and businesses. What we are mostly expecting is that by the end of 2022, early 23, the inflationary pressures will recede. Why? Because number one among these pressures is supply chain disruptions. What is causing these disruptions? Mostly the fact that waves come at a different time in different places, and restrictions are imposed at a different time in different places, interrupting the normal delivery of goods. And also because there has been a structural change. One of the interesting shifts that came from the pandemic is the high demand for drivers. We all shop from home. That has impacted the availability of drivers to drive the trucks. And also we are seeing many workers through the pandemic changing their view as to what they want to do. And in a tight labor market in the United States, obviously they have more opportunities. As these supply chain disruptions are contained, we see some welcoming signs that, for example, shipping costs are dropping. They had gone down by a quarter to 1/3. We think that this pressure on inflation would recede. But we need to remember that there are other sources of pressure. For example, climate shocks. They affect agricultural productivity, through it, food prices. While we are cautiously optimistic, we are also on the view that central banks are now in a place where they have to use their instruments to push inflation, and more importantly, inflation expectations down. As they do that, we know that there will be a spillover impact on the recovery, on growth, and on emerging markets and developing countries with high level of especially dollar-denominated debt. So what is our advice to central banks? Communicate your intentions early and clearly based on data. And to countries with high level on debts, already now work on a rational response, meaning if you can stretch maturities, if you can push payments down the road, do it. Improve the transparency of debt management, look at ways in which currency mismatches can be addressed. Flexible exchange rates can also help. We are engaged in that both globally, but also country by country, to give our best advice to our members. So we don't, because where is the trick? The trick is we have to balance two objectives: prevent the anchoring of inflation expectations and prevent a sudden stop of the recovery. How we balance those two is going to be a hugely important task for policymakers and for us at the fund.
You mentioned climate shocks, and there's of course also energy shocks. So I want to just tackle both of those. First, I want to talk about the short-term energy crisis that we've seen particularly impacting Europe, but also oil prices and fluctuation and rising oil prices. Is there an ideal oil price for the current economic situation, but also how these short-term crises can be dealt with? And then we can talk about, of course, the energy transition and climate change.
But the fact that demand shot up very rapidly while supply was still falling behind, of course, created a short-term pressure on energy prices. That is correctable in relatively short period of time just by lifting up restrictions on productions, lifting up supply. For Europe, part of the problem is also that many energy utilities are pressed to switch from gas to oil to coal, something that they assume to be a temporary measure. But what this shock demonstrated is that the most ideal thing about oil price or energy prices overall is to be relatively predictable and relatively stable, because what we saw with the 2020 drop in demand and drop in price hitting oil producers, oil exporters tremendously, and then the reverse, oil prices shooting up, hitting the oil consumers, the importers, severely. This is what is most dangerous in our view. When we look at the trajectory of oil prices, so to answer your question, a stable price that balances demand supply and also provides the equilibrium between the interests of consumers and the interests of producers. This is the price that helps the most. Looking into the future, we have a medium-term trend, and then we have a long-term trend. The long-term trend, if the world is to decarbonize, would be a gradual reduction of oil, of hydrocarbon prices over time. In the medium term, though, it may be different, because in the medium term, one of the measures that are being put in place, and we expect they would expand to encourage decarbonization, is putting a price on carbon, be it through tax or trade or regulatory equivalency. And that price on carbon inevitably pushes prices up. And again, policymakers, especially policymakers with regard to climate policy, very similar to what I said about central banks, they have to communicate their intentions clearly. We call this forward guidance. And this forward guidance has to be over a fairly long period of time, so then everybody can make an adjustment accordingly. We saw in the current conditions how the fate of oil exporters is much, brighter. We project growth above 4%, whereas the fate of oil importers is bleaker. We think that they would lose on aggregate 7.5% growth, real growth. In other words, they would be worse off after the pandemic. So we have to think about price in the context of, we don't want some to be much better off than others, because this destabilizes the world economy, and also because it shrinks demand from the countries that may be disproportionately impacted.
I want to very briefly touch upon the Middle East and North Africa region. Of course, there's much that we can discuss about it, but here in Abu Dhabi, all sights are on hosting COP28 next year in 2023, and a lot of thought about climate, but also another big issue for the region is youth unemployment. And of course, the pandemic comes with, and there are many people who have said that there's, the pandemic, but there's also digitization and the changes in the economy, and that double whammy impacting unemployment in general, but particularly youth unemployment. So I wanted to talk about the region very briefly, but specifically from the point of view of youth unemployment and what can be done to tackle this issue.
Let me say that in the dangerous divergence I spoke about, what is happening to young people is unfortunately a big component. When you look at unemployment, who is hit the hardest? Youth, women, in your region, foreign workers. And youth is the most significantly impacted component. So what is necessary are labor market policies that benefit young people. We are talking about a social compact that is oriented towards youth employment and is comprehensive. It has attention to skills. It has attention to schemes that encourage employers to hire young people, and it has attention to youth entrepreneurship. I'm very pleased to see in quite a number of countries in the region, like Jordan, Morocco, these are exactly the policies that are being introduced. They have quantitative parameters. How many young people we want to bring in the labor force, how we are going to use lower social security payments when you hire young people as an incentive to hire young people. What is the component of youth entrepreneurship that is being actively promoted so young people have the confidence in themselves? I believe very strongly that we at the fund have a huge obligation to give a helping hand to our members in the region by promoting these policies and also by helping countries to learn from each other and compete with each other. Who is going to do better for their young people? And if I may, a word on climate, I am so thrilled that Egypt and then you, Abu Dhabi, are the hosts of the next COPs. Why? Because I expect this would help us to lift up attention to, one, adaptation. For your region, climate shocks are already devastating. And two, to solidarity, helping countries that are faced with tremendous challenges overcome them fast. And you would see the fund right there making the case for that capacity for us to accelerate the transition, but in a fair and inclusive manner.
Thank you. I have a final question or topic that I want to discuss with you, which is your own personal leadership. You came to this position at the IMF towards the end of 2019, and you couldn't have imagined that much of your time will be about fighting this pandemic and the impact it's had. So I want to ask you about the lessons you've learned from that so far and how it's changed your leadership, but also your vision for the fund.
But the most important lesson is when in crisis, work fast to diagnose what is this crisis. Crisis like no other. We cannot apply lessons from the global financial crisis automatically. And I think the fund has been exemplary in diagnosing this crisis as both supply and demand shock and proposing the right measures to the world. Second, lean forward and help the most vulnerable. Be quick on your feet. And the fund has been remarkably fast. I actually got in the midst of the crisis calls from presidents and from prime ministers saying, Kristalina, thank you. If you didn't come up with your financial lifeline, I don't know how we were going to pay our doctors and nurses and support our people and our businesses. So that is a very, very important lesson as well. But the third lesson is probably the most important. Work with others to build resilience to future shocks. Take this pandemic as a very stark reminder that we are in a more shock-prone world, and because we are interconnected, these shocks very quickly cross borders. And of course, the climate shocks are another example. And then for an institution like the IMF to think about economic resilience in a more comprehensive manner. What do I mean? Build resilience for people, educated, healthy, with sound social protection. People and communities are more resilient to shocks. Think about resilience of the economy in a more people-centered manner. How do we secure jobs? How do we secure small businesses to continue to function? How do we provide support to the economy in a crisis? And three, think about the resilience of our planet. We cannot possibly afford to continue willy-nilly to use our natural resources without consideration for future generations. So that notion of the fund being an institution for macroeconomic and financial stability, growth, and employment in a more shock-prone world means our ability to help countries with these resilience policies for growth that is sustainable and is inclusive.
You've spoken about uncertainty and that we have to be adaptable and resilient to a shock-prone world. And there are so many further topics I want to talk about, but I know our time is coming to a close. So I wanted to ask you a very final question, which is, how have you adapted to working from home? Ordinarily, we'd be doing this at the IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C., and yet we're doing this through Zoom. So how have you adapted to working from home and working with your team?
Well, we had a test on March 13th on whether we can work from home. And then, boom, next thing that happened, we were working from home. And I think the adaptability of technology is remarkable. The big winner of this crisis is digitalization. It has also its own risks, but that's for another conversation. What we have to recognize, though, is that we have to move to a hybrid model. We are social beings. Not interacting person to person has a cost. So we actually were hoping beginning of January to be piloting the hybrid model for the IMF. Now we are postponing this because of Omicron, but it will inevitably come. Agility, adaptability, lifelong learning for the future. This is what is demanded from all of us. And we have just proven that we people are remarkably creative and adaptable, but we are also social beings. And if we want to retain a positive working environment, it does require interactions, human interactions of the kind that build this non-tangible capital that is the strength of the collective, us being more effective than the sum of individuals are.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your very honest and insightful remarks and taking the time to speak to the National. I wish you all the best. And most importantly, I wish you and your team all the health in the world as we get through this, this uncertain time.
Thank you, and same to you.